Welcome everyone, and thanks for all the panelists to be here. We're going to share a little bit about our journey with the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs here in London, and how this led us to talk about neighborhoods. And we're going to start, as we usually do, with a poem. And I'm going to pass to Judi to share the poem with us.
Thanks very much, Louise. And we start all of our gatherings with some kind of a reflection and a check-in. It's a way for us to be grounded to the where we are right now, and also to build relationships with each other. So the poem that or the reflection that I chose for today is called On Community. There is a providence that brought us here and gave us to each other at this time. In and through us, a greater tapestry of creativity is being woven. It is difficult for us to envisage this. We live such separate and often quite removed lives. Yet behind all this seeming separation, a deeper unity anchors everything. This is one of the powerful intimations of the great religious traditions. The ideal of community is not the forcing together of separate individuals into the spurious unity of community. The great traditions tell us that community somehow already exists. When we come together in compassion and generosity, this hidden belonging begins to come alive between us. In order for community to emerge, we need time, vision, and a certain rhythm of silence with each other. Perhaps community is a constellation. Each one of us is a different light in the emerging collective brightness. Constellation of light has greater power of illumination than any single light would have on its own. Together, we increase brightness.
Thank you so much, Judi. And I think this is a good start for the conversations that we are about to have. So yeah, like I said, last year we took a deep dive into the SDGs, and the core message of our work was really integration. And to solve all our wicked problems, we need to do this cross-sector collaboration. We need multiple levels of government working together. We need an understanding of the interconnectedness of our society and our life here on this planet. And really it's at the local level that we can address our environmental, social, and economic crisis. We recognize that those things could be different, and our relationships, how we do things together, can be vastly improved as well. We are at a point in history where there is an appetite for this pivot, and place is a fundamental component for this reconnection. Whether we're talking about experiencing life socially in a public space, rather than isolated in your own house in private spaces, being in close contact with nature, with the environment, choosing the real world over the virtual world, and sometimes, like now, we make the choice for the virtual world. And our community is really a big part of that experience. The lack of community, or the siloed communities, virtual or interest-based communities, is one of our biggest challenges today. So place-based communities really foster diversity, and diversity enables integration of people, ideas, and purposes. And by truly experiencing your neighborhood, we can get connected and get inspired. And I want to try to piece the SDG. We're going to do, a little contextualization before we dive in. Piece the SDGs together with neighborhoods and with the Place Matters conference. And there's a nice video about the SDGs. It's a 2-minute video from the United Nations. We'll have the link for you to watch, for you who are not familiar with the concept. And those are very high level goals, but we wanted to understand what they mean for our city, and we did an extensive community consultation so we can localize the SDGs. Really wanted to understand how does that make sense here in London. So just a quick overview of our session today. Misha is going to add a little bit more about the context of our journey here. Then you're going to hear some of the short personal stories about the prototype, the interviews that we did. We're going to have a roundtable discussion about those and the SDGs. And then we'll conclude a session with some reflections and a call to action. So with this, Misha, I'll pass over to you.
Thanks, Luis. So my name's Misha Schlemmer, and I grew up in London, Ontario. I live in Old South, where I also grew up, and I am part of this core team of this ULab process. And so I'm just going to explain a little bit about how we ended up arriving at this presentation today. We're each community members. We're kind of coming into this capacity through a program that we organized called the Sustainable Development Leaders. And I'm just going to share my screen and show you a little bit more about that. So in about 2015, this institute, the Presencing Institute out of the MIT, Massachusetts Institute for Technologies Management School, the Sloan School of Management, runs this Presencing Institute. And it really teaches a program called Theory U. And you can find out more on their website at presencing.org. And they run several different programs every year where they teach about Theory U in September to December. And then they have an actual societal transformation lab that happens from February to May. And so in London, community members have been working on studying this theory since about 2015. And in the last 2 years, we started actually running this societal transformation laboratory. And so I'll just show you where we ended up with that. We have a Git book, which is kind of like a Wikipedia page that explains the work that we've been doing. We'll provide the links for that as well. And there you can see more of what we did in 2019, as well as kind of what has been happening in London around this process since 2015, and then what we did in 2020. So this year in 2020, we decided to, in our first year, we had a very open theme. We were looking at supporting thriving in London across community, work, and family. And we came up with a prototype that looked around, or that kind of built a process of co-sensing walks in nature with a community member who you otherwise wouldn't have occasion to connect with. And this year, we decided to create a specific focus around the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And so the core team of the Theory U London Lab, let's say, created this London SDG Leaders Program. We knew that we were going to have these 5 half-day research and design solutions. We were going to have 15 sustainable development leaders from the city or fellows that were going to work through this process together. We were going to be using the Presencing Institute's methodology, and we would be working within that kind of structure of as many as 300 teams around the world doing these labs. And so this was a sort of partnership amongst all these different institutions that some of us sort of represent in other parts of our lives. And we were going to be really focusing on, as Louise said, localizing the application of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And so we felt like we needed to really learn more about the Sustainable Development Goals and understand how would we actually localize the SDGs in London. And so in this kind of Wikipedia page, you can see each of the different gatherings that we had. They're listed by date, and then they have a little background on what we were doing at that event. And so in our co-initiating, that was sort of as we were starting the process, we gathered together with probably about 20 leaders from around the city. And we have sort of a graphic recording here that I think I have open somewhere. This graphic recording was created at that event. And these are some of the representation that was in the room. We had leaders from healthcare, leaders from education, nonprofit leaders, leaders from sort of academia and research, leaders from tech, all different backgrounds, City of London, kind of environmental activists, all different kind of expertise in the room. And we actually used our prototype from our first year, our co-sensing walk, to land in the room. We had a co-sensing walk in pairs amongst that group, and we started to imagine what could be the future of London, and what are these 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and which are the ones that we perhaps feel that we work through the most in our daily work. So we did some exercise around that, and we're just really learning more about the Sustainable Development Goals. So then in later on, I think this was in April or so, we had identified sort of 3 Sustainable Development Goals that were the focus of most of our work, which were the SDG 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities, SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, and SDG 1, no poverty. And it wasn't that we were saying we were exclusively going to focus on those SDGs. We were just trying to create a place to start our work, and to imagine, also to learn about how the SDGs overlap, because that was sort of a really important learning, was to just see how much they overlap. So this was one of the activities we did in that session. We used an online kind of I think it's called Mentimeter tool, to be able to to answer some of these questions around, for example, decent work, when we're looking at some of the different indicators that have been identified for how we would measure decent work and economic growth. We were trying to understand, was this an easy to work on challenge, or was this a really big challenge that was going to be very difficult to work on? And so we were really trying to understand, how do we localize these SDGs in London and begin to understand which ones are the easy ones, which ones are the hard ones, and what are roadblocks there. And all of the Presencing Institute's process is really designed to get us to build a prototype. So we took all of this information that we were creating, I think then in about, actually, back to this one, in our July 9 prototyping one, the harvest is what that was kind of our work in each session. So you can look at all of this information on our Wikipedia kind of page, and you could see that we were doing different processes. We did a sculpture process where we were trying to really embody who the stakeholders were. And we were really trying to figure out kind of what potentially could be these different, what could be a prototype that we could all begin to work on. And so we actually came up with all of these prototypes, these different prototypes ideas. And then we had to sort of whittle down to figure out what could be one prototype that we begin to work on. And there were some common themes that we noticed, especially around neighborhood, the scale that we wanted to work in. And so then we developed this prototype, and this prototype kind of plan, which is essentially what we're going to show to you today. And essentially what that prototype was looking at, we felt like we had a lot of work that's happening in London that would be contributing towards the Sustainable Development Goals, but that the people who are doing that work potentially don't know about the Sustainable Development Goals, don't know how their work contributes to it. And the people who are tracking the Sustainable Development Goals don't necessarily know that the work is happening and what the indicator of that would be. And so our prototype sort of emerged as, how could we begin to actually identify what is the work that is happening in London, and how can we learn and give profile to that work that's happening, so that people in their communities could know that there are ways that they can get involved locally within their neighborhood to participate in a sustainable future for our whole world. And so that kind of our process for that was really around creating a kind of a dialogue within a neighborhood. And so we're going to hear from our panelists next, where they're going to tell their stories about how these dialogues happened in the neighborhoods that they explored. And we also created a definition of neighborhood that gave us a lot of flexibility. So neighborhood could mean sort of the place that you lived. It could also mean an organization. It could mean you know, a family community. And so each of our panelists is going to talk about what they were learning within the neighborhood discussion that they were having. And then we were sort of starting to think about who the people were that would be willing to participate in collecting some of this information. And then we have a website over here, which is building off of the work that's been done to localize the SDGs in London already. We're looking to take each of the SDGs and begin to tell those stories of what is the work that's happening towards each of these SDGs within these communities. And so this website kind of has been built as a placeholder. And we're going to start to work on populating it with some of the stories that we've been learning about. And these are the local indicators with different descriptions. So, you know, the SDGs are a pretty complex evaluation system, let's say. There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals. There are many targets, and then there are hundreds of indicators that indicate whether or not we're succeeding towards that goal. And so I think now I was going to invite, let's make sure I covered everything. I think I did. I'm going to invite our panelists to share their stories about the interviews that they've started over the last few months as we've started working on this prototype together. So I believe our first person is Marianne. And you're on mute there.
Thank you, Misha. I chose the organization of Indwell for my interviews. And just to give you a little idea of who Indwell is, Indwell is creating homes for some of London's most marginalized citizens. One of the residents of Indwell, Robert, says that living at Indwell has made all the difference in the world. Coming from being around crime every day, he now lives in a nice building. His apartment is clean and cozy. Everyone who visits says it's so nice. Robert says there's a sense of security in more ways than one. The people make all the difference, and he says if he ever got in dire need, he knows there are people there that he can count on. That sense of community runs through Indwell. So Indwell opened their first building in London just last July. 69 people now call Woodfield Gate home, and several of them had been stuck at Parkwood, unable to be discharged because there wasn't a safe and reliable place for them to go. Supportive housing helps patients as they continue their journey toward wellness, avoiding rehospitalization and even homelessness. This is a win-win because housing patients at Parkwood can cost upwards of $20,000 a month. And now beds can be freed up, improving access to the mental health care program there. Indwell's program model ensures that tenants are offered support that meets their unique needs with dignity. So 10 staff work to build relationships and create community through recreational activities and community connections, as well as support for addictions and life skills to help build independence. Julie Ryan, the Community Engagement Coordinator, explains it is about building community. It's not only the relationships between the tenants and the staff, but the relationships between the tenants themselves. Many of them have a shared history, shared experiences, and they can support each other when they are in those low points in their lives. And they've seen amazing friendships that form. New buildings are built to passive house standards, helping Indwell build for long-term sustainability and keep operating costs as low as possible. A second building with 72 units is slated to open in early 2022. So that's just a brief intro into who Indwell is, and we'll get a little bit more into it with our roundtable discussions later.
Thanks, Marianne. And next we're going to hear from Judi about the discussion that she had in Neighbourhood.
So thanks very much, Misha. So Marianne and I had the opportunity to interview board members from the Italian Seniors Project and to visit Residenza Ortano, which is a brand new building. And when I say brand new, it opened, it's just in the process of opening. So the model is a partnership as well. So it's a partnership with Cheshire Independent Living Services and also the Royal Canadian Legion. So Residenza Ortano is the second apartment building that is built and run by the Italian Seniors Project in London. The first is Residenza Italiano across the street on Hamilton Road. Board members of the Italian Seniors Project say that it is designed to foster a sense of community. Claudio DeVenzio is a board member and said that anyone can build a square block, fill it with people, and close the door. We're trying to build communities, and I can personally say that I have witnessed this passion in my conversation with various members of the board. Despite a global pandemic, Residenza Ortano finished construction and tenants started to move in a couple of weeks ago. Residenza Ortano has also partnered with the Royal Canadian Legion to support veterans and who are or were homeless, and with Cheshire Independent Living Services to provide 12 wheelchair accessible affordable apartments with 24-hour access to personal supports on site. Cheshire supports individuals with significant physical disabilities in southwestern Ontario. So Michael became homeless because of a marital breakdown, and like many veterans, was too proud to go to a shelter. John, who works almost full-time as a volunteer with the Legion to identify veterans who are homeless, became connected with Michael. The Legion will pay for hotel rooms, and I thought this was amazing, actually. They'll work with the veterans for often up to 2 years until the person is ready to be on their own and be housed. John works with the City of London, the Coordinated Access, and with London Cares to find housing. To quote the Legion, we're hoping by giving them an affordable place to live and build a community, they'll be able to stabilize themselves and live comfortably. In London, the Legion is aligned with the broader Legion initiative to leave the streets behind. Michael told me that he is extremely happy, so grateful, and so proud of his new apartment. John told me last week that in London, we were down to 5 homeless veterans, and this week we're down to 1. I just thought that was a collaborative success story. I'm just going to briefly give 2 stories from Cheshire. Cheshire, we support people with significant physical disabilities in southwestern Ontario, nonprofit organization since 1976. We support people in a neighborhood model of service that includes supportive housing models as well as Residenza Ortano. And Residenza Ortano is our 10th supportive housing initiative and partnership. Many people waiting for service are poor, they're on ODSP and need wheelchair accessible spaces with access to 24-hour support. Cheshire was invited to partner with Residenza Ortano to access 12 wheelchair accessible affordable housing with 24-hour access to service, and the personal support is funded by the Ministry of Health. Many people waiting for this service are in our long-term care homes because there was no other viable option. So 2 individuals are being repatriated or moving from long-term care homes to Residenza Ortano. So I'll tell you about 1. Ruth was on vacation, I think she's in her 50s or 60s, out of country when a sudden illness resulted in a spinal cord injury. She was transferred to the London Health Sciences Centre and then to Parkwood. This was a very overwhelming time for her and her family, and some options that were actually not discussed with her during her recovery. She was transferred to a long-term care home outside of London. A year later, she began to explore some of the options that might be available. She became connected with a spinal cord injury, Spinal Cord Ontario, and the staff told her about Cheshire and the assisted living options and residence at Ortano. Ruth told us that she never felt she belonged in a long-term care home and could not be more happy to move back into the community and be closer to her family who live in London. And I wanted to briefly share a story about someone who is in their 20s. Bailey moved into residence for Ortano earlier this month. He's in his 20s, has a disability and requires a wheelchair for mobility. His passion is personal training, and he hopes to be a personal trainer. He had been living in residence at Fanshawe, and his only other option was to move back home with his parents. He likes his independence, and residence at Ortano has given him the opportunity to keep it. So those are my 3 stories. Back to you, Misha.
Thanks, Judi. We're now going to hear from Johann about the community that he was connecting with.
Thanks, Misha. Well, this was an exciting story. I've known this individual in the family, and his name is Louis Glabush. He's a 3rd-year mathematics student at Western. And really, even though we were talking about his engagement with the youth in Booley area, Booley Street, which is a public housing in the northeast part of London, it really is a story about the importance of education and learning in the youth and the intersections of youth and education, which happens to be in a place, Booley, and the issues around there, but also really about how it intersects with a lot of the Sustainable Development Goals. And for him, he'd been working with these 11 to 16-year-olds in Booley, and they were focused on a program of moral empowerment, community engagement and service, and developing literacy in science and mathematics and offering mentorships. And so these are kids that are around the age of 11 to 16, mainly from the South Sudan and who've lived in Canada or London for the last 2 to 3 years or for most of their lives. So that's sort of the context. And really I was spending time interviewing Louis, and I think will have a transcript and maybe that can be available. But anyway, so the key thing is this involvement in what they call this Junior Youth Spiritual Empowerment Program. And there's actually, I think, about 3 or 4 of them, or maybe even a half a dozen in the City of London, and this is just one of them that he's working on. And what they do is they engage in a long process. So this individual himself was part of a junior youth program where he was, when in his junior youth age, in his middle school years, and then high school and that. And then he became an animator working with other youth. And in this particular program, one of the things that they focus on, well, currently right now, is this notion of how to develop habits of an orderly mind. Isn't that wonderful, doing that program with junior youth, and which deals with the habits of an orderly mind, and it also orderly mind, but it also includes mathematic literacy. And so now imagine this group where you have, whether it's half a dozen young people engaging with someone who's in the university, and really bringing things that they would not normally be available to them, even in the public education system. And I want to get to 2 specific things. One is that, I'm just going to read a quote from Louis, and he said that it was, how can we develop our capacity to contribute to our community and identify those issues? So this is what he's doing with those youth. And so that the participation in the junior youth program are constantly thinking about what the issues in their neighborhoods are, which we haven't identified, that would be on them to identify at a later time, but that they're developing the framework to think about that and to address it. So these are 11 to 12-year-olds that he's accompanying to help them identify community issues in that. And in areas where the program has expanded, because this is part of an international global program, it's what has, and to look at areas that have already taken root in their community, and how do they begin to take more profound social action in dealing with the specific needs of that community. So they've done things like collecting garbage and other immediate things. And obviously they're having to deal with a lot of issues around drugs in their community. The other thing that they've done that we talked about in our conversation, because it is public housing, he did make this one quote, because as it relates to our group, which is, it would be, there were the very difficult and typical issues of maintenance. So that a lot of people have been waiting on something to be fixed for however long, and it doesn't happen or something like that. But it's more than just an issue of the city's budget, really. And he quotes, but also it would be helpful if network of volunteers could think about how they could service those needs, how they could, if people who have the skills in terms of construction or maintenance or anything like that, how they could make themselves available to the people who are living in social housing, who are waiting on these things. So that's sort of a direct, practical aspect that these kids and the people that are living in these things, how can they get the maintenance issues addressed? The last thing I'll talk about, just in terms of really the most exciting part, is the linking in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, about education. And Lewis is particularly passionate about that. I won't get into a lot of detail, but just to say that the one or two highlights is that they actually, Lewis works with these middle school youth, junior youth, not only in Bully Lane, but virtually with students all around the world, in Russia, Romania, Nigeria, and of course, Canada. And the big theme that Lewis is really passionate about is that while we understand the traditional public education, they work with a group of really motivated and talented students that really want to accelerate their learning, where these are 13-year-olds, remind you, that are talking about, it says here, they're learning concepts at first or second year university level, and then engaging with things like neural networks or something which is beyond anything that they would probably learn within the next 10 years. And they do it because it's something that they've decided to do because they're interested in that thing. And then the last thing I'll say he notes is, and I don't see how there could be a project in school in the current kind of classroom context that would allow students to learn second year university math and then apply it to the concept of neural network and artificial intelligence at the age of 13 or even at the age of 18. I think that's something that to see that in our context of this alternative education is very promising. So to me, the big excitement was working with youth and empowering them with things that the normal traditional frameworks just assume that young people are not capable of, really accelerating their learning and then giving them a framework to actively engage in the community. So it was pretty exciting to see him doing this. And I know there's about a half a dozen other projects like this throughout the city. So it's a message of youth and learning, non-traditional alternative learning in which our systems don't really, and if you get these youth going, then they can really engage with the Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank you, Johann. And next, we'll hear from Luis about his community dialogue.
Thanks, Misha. I want to tell a story about Jessica. Jessica had a loving father that became very violent every time he drank. After years in this situation, her mom finally got full custody, and it was just the two of them. But being a single mom with no other family and a low-paying job was pretty hard for both of them. Eventually, Jessica left home. She was 17, and by then she was already drinking and smoking daily. After a few years and some bad choices, she found herself in a homeless situation. Eventually, she made it into a woman's shelter where she's trying to find housing. Now, one of the challenges is that most of the housing options are for non-smoking people, and this is not really a reality to many people in this situation. Quitting smoking is not easy when on top of the addiction, the really chemical addiction, there's a huge social and emotional pressure to keep smoking. Jessica now is very hopeful because she understands the importance of having a quiet place, being homeless and now being in a shelter, and you know the prospect of maybe now find housing, the importance of having a quiet place to rest, food on the table, and she can actually see now a way forward to come out of this vicious cycle that started so many years ago in her life. The story about Jessica, well, Jessica is a fictional character, and this story is fictional, but the elements of the story are very real. And the reason I told a fictional story is, well, first, I didn't want to share that kind of information about anyone. I really wanted to protect their privacy. They're already in a vulnerable situation. And two, my interview was, I was with Judi, and we talked with Greg Cooper, who is the manager of the homeless prevention team in the City of London, and Dave Purdy, who is the manager of housing services. And I had a chance to visit also Indwell building, and I met some of the residents and some of the staff working there. And Dundas Open Street is my new favorite place here in London, and I've been meeting and talking to some people experiencing homelessness also. And all the elements in my story, they're all very real. But those interconnections, that scenario is very complex to distill and to even choose one specific story. A little bit about the two folks that I talked with. So Craig really understands those challenges because he has been immersed in housing for over a decade. And he's working hard to put the housing first principles in action. Greg said, for example, one of the key pieces of the housing stability plan is to assist people where they are at right now, and not only economically, but also around not putting parameters around people to access supports. For example, you have to quit smoking if you want to get housing. You gotta have this document, you gotta have a job, but really trying to meet people where they are. And what he's mentioned is about the housing stability plan that the whole year of 2019, they did many community consultations to develop this plan. And they just started putting into action into 2020, I believe, March, which also Craig mentioned coincided nicely with the pandemic. So it was a challenge but they've been moving forward. The other person I interviewed was Dave Purdy, so he's the manager of housing services. And David says that achieving housing stability is foundational to everything else: health, work, connection to your community, your own identity. We all need a place of our own. He also talks about housing as a human right, and this is part of the housing stability plan. Like, it's one of the principles, one of those foundations. For me, what was striking talking to the two of them was how much they care. They really care about the people. They're not just coming to work and trying to get things done, but they really care about the communities that they're serving, and they're really proud of the work. And proud to know that they have a positive impact in someone's life in the future. And of course, they recognize that there is much more that needs to be done, not only in terms of providing better services, but also in a more systemic shift in redesigning our institutions that create those conditions in the first place. And I think for me, one of those reasons that having those conversations and meeting those people and actually understanding what are their challenges is fundamental, in the sense that, and I want to just wrap it up. Like, there's a quote from a book that I was reading that it says, "The intellect divides us into our separate selves. Only the heart can make the social bond. True community rests in the free acknowledgement from person to person, so that the individual grows in his response to his fellows." So for me, this experience is really about connecting with the people to really move forward in those not only emergency responses, but the systemic changes that we want to see in our society, in our city. Over to you, Michelle.
Thanks, Luis. Thank you all for sharing the stories of your interviews and of your discussions in neighborhoods, in communities. And so now we're going to have just a little open discussion about how do we place these learnings back within these SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. If we're imagining localizing them to London and demonstrating that we're making significant improvements in London, and also showing where the shortfalls are in London that we need to focus on through the next period of time. And so I was wondering if you could speak to this. There's many common themes, but I was wondering, especially around the limited access to wealth and around trying to reduce poverty. What things from your interview stand out for you around reducing poverty? Where do you think those communities are managing to do that, and where do you think they're struggling?
Well, I think we've seen from a number of the different interviews that there is a real desire to make affordable housing available, and looking at what people are receiving in social assistance and ensuring that after they've paid the rent, there is still some money to have a dignified life, and that poverty is often exacerbated by that fear of where you're going to get your next meal or how are you going to struggle to survive. And once that is addressed, then you can move forward and be more integrated into the community. You can start thinking about schooling, you can start thinking about finding work. And so it all comes from that place of making sure that you have shelter.
I would just add the math, which is striking, that most of the people with disabilities supported by Cheshire residents or Ortano are on ODSP, the Ontario Disability Support, and the shelter allowance portion of that is $497. So you can't even get a room in a house for $497. So just every time I'm faced with that math, I think it's no easy task, but that we have to advocate for an increase in some of that. It's just, it doesn't work. So
for me, when we think of these interconnectedness, and if we think of these 17 tall trees of the Sustainable Development Goals, or these branches, whatever, to me, the underlying interconnectedness of everything is, you've heard me use that expression before, which is how trees communicate, is the mycelium, which is a fungus. And so I'm involved in some projects where it's all about what does community learning mean at an individual, a community, and an institutional level. And I'm not talking about education in a formal sense, but I'm saying learning how to reach out and access services, learning how to work with other people to create agency, learning about even how to get formal education to increase one's job possibilities in that. And so I think the sort of the lingua franca is that all these individuals, wherever you are in this whole ecosystem, we're all constantly, even the 6 of us right now, or 5 of us, are exchanging information and knowledge, and we're having this sort of humble attitude of learning and sharing information at both, with individuals at a community and institutional level. And when this mycelium or this fungus becomes really robust and strong and free-flowing, and you think of all this information, knowledge, wisdom, experience, pain, suffering, and all that, the more that circulates, the more freely it does, then it fosters the richness of each of these sort of 17 trees of the SDGs to thrive, and then they all are interconnected. So learning and community is the underlying interconnectedness, or the tissue.
Yeah, those are very good points, and I totally agree with all of them. For example, what Johann is saying, for me, one of the things that we heard in our conversation is that the answer is not just money, and it's also about how we use the money, and we didn't pay attention to the housing problem. There was a growing problem for many years, and what I see from this conversation is the importance of that community, right? Of that mycelium, of that connection, and just to tie back to to the theme of the conference, like that's one of the first reasons that place matters. To understand our problems, to care about them, we need to be connected. We really need to experience what is happening in our communities, and I think this can be transformational. One of the very powerful insights. Sorry, Julia, I don't know if you're gonna mention this during a roundtable. I really think it was brilliant when you said that place matters only if you have one. Place matters only if you have a place. And I think this is something that Judi brought to the table. And usually when we're having those conversations, we're talking about, you know, place as community place, but not our own private space or our own house. And I think a lot of the times we're talking from a very privileged position that we already have our place, and we're talking about creating this shared community place making initiatives. But it's important to understand that and it's one of the principles of the SDGs, leave no one behind. So the chain is only as strong as the weakest link. We really need to ensure that everybody has a place of their own before we start building our community, or even doing this together is very important. And to Marianne's point, yes, like David and Craig said, housing is foundational. It's really, you need housing, and it's kind of a feedback loop, right? You don't have housing, so it's hard to find a job or education or health, or if you don't have a job, then it's, you know, it's difficult to get to housing. And I think the SDGs is really to understand the systemic issues here, and to break out of this cycle, this feedback loop that keeps people spiraling down on those difficult situations.
Thank you. Were there any, when you think about what you've all just mentioned about your community interviews, were there any particular surprises of SDGs that come to mind that were relevant within the work of the communities that you were in?
There's a quote from Ban Ki-moon, who was a UN Secretary General, and I think what I learned to just reinforce what he said. So the quote from Ban Ki-moon says, "Saving our planet, lifting people out of poverty, advancing economic growth, these are one and the same fight. We must connect the dots between climate change, water scarcity, energy shortages, global health, food security, and women's empowerment. Solutions to one problem must be solutions for all." And so to me, it was the interconnectedness, where you had specifically these young kids living in public housing, dealing with issues of drugs and, you know, quality of life, but we're also actively engaged in their own journey of agency at an individual and community level, and learning to identify neighborhood problems and that they were all interconnected. So it's not so much a surprise, but it just reinforced a statement that the UN Secretary General made at a global level, and seeing it applicable at a neighborhood level. And most importantly, the one message is, it's really about, I mean, it's the youth, the importance of the youth, not to the exclusion of other people, but the youth. You see the power of the youth and what they're able to do.
One of the things that I was thrilled to see with Indwell is how they do integrate a number of the sustainable development goals that we had brought up within our working group. One being sustainable cities, where some of the targets around sustainable cities are not just safe and affordable housing, but low impact on the environment. So Indwell adds solar panels whenever they can. They adopt a passive house strategy, so that the cost of running the facility in the future is lower, because too often developments are built for low cost construction, but that the cost to maintain those buildings escalate over time. So having that long-term vision helps not just the immediate need for housing, but the long-term need for sustainable low-cost housing. But also integrating the SDGs around providing decent work and equality. So these facilities with supportive staff, create meaningful jobs for Londoners to assist people in acting out these SDGs in a meaningful way, and provide the supports for people. And then once the residents have that sense of place and the affordable housing, it's amazing what things happen. So, for example, at Woodfield Gate, I don't think any or very few people had jobs when they came into the residence, but they did a resident survey just 6 months ago, and they found that 18% of the residents now either have part-time or full-time jobs. So it really is a testament to how everything is intertwined. So if you help on one side, it does help some of the other SDGs as well. So things are really interconnected.
The one thing that struck me was how passionate people were. The Dave Purdy of the City of London Housing, Craig Cooper, the board members of the Italian Seniors Project, just how passionate people were, and they really wanted to help. But that we didn't know, like I've worked in health with housing in the City of London now for almost 50 years, and I've been involved with the residents of Ortano. I didn't know that London Cares was involved, and that the Legion was relying on London Cares, and that Craig Cooper with the homeless initiative was relying on them. So one of the things going forward that even for my own learning is trying to understand how things are interconnected. So, and with residents or Ortano, Marianne is much more knowledgeable about the energy efficient, but they've built an energy efficient. They're building apartments that they don't want to be involved in building anything that they wouldn't live in themselves. And they've, in terms of community, they've built community spaces. They've built space for future community gardens. So SDG 2 with the food. It's just amazing. So I'm really excited to see how we start to map some of the interconnections.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's important to mention is those interconnections, we're talking about them right now, we're talking about the SDGs, but for the most part of it, those interconnections were being made by the people we're talking to. They were not they're not talking about SDG this or 7 or 10 or whatever, but they understand, and I'd say because they're doing the work on the ground, they understand those interconnections even better than we do about the work that they're doing. For example, the housing stability plan, it's part of one of the core areas is providing supports to the community, and that even includes working with them to find employment opportunities. So you can see there is a lot to do with no poverty, decent work, and sustainable cities. And I think that community belonging goes beyond that. It's not only, it's not only creating those services and providing those supports, is the redesigning the conditions that everyone can have what we call social capital, where we can create wealth even if you don't have a lot of money. So you can be wealthy even though you're not rich. And there are so many services, so many products that were freely available in our communities not that long ago. And you can think about from childcare, just neighbors watching each other kids, to food sovereignty, to entertainment, and so many other things that we can have in our community that doesn't necessarily involve creating a service, creating a program, and find funding and bring all this money into the community, but offer those things for our neighborhoods, for our street, for our communities, and just coming from a very different way. And I believe that everybody that we talk to, they understand the power of creating health connected communities to provide a lot of those things that we'll touch on many of the SDGs, like we mentioned here, like environment and zero hunger and education and many others.
Just, you know, as listening to Luis talk, you know, there's this very fine line between complexity and interconnections and chaos and this sort of Gordian knot. Sometimes, you know, these systems and all these things, because they're all built separately and then they interconnect, you almost have this Gordian knot, which becomes impossible for any one person to figure out. And so you end up just focusing on a little small piece of the knot and trying to untangle that. And we know that Alexander the Great's solution to the Gordian knot was to take a sword and just cut it in half. We know we can't do that. So I think one of the interesting things going forward as we explore the SDGs, the interconnectedness, the mycelium, is to see, well, where are the things where it becomes this Gordian knot, where it becomes intractable to move because everything is so interconnected that you can't move and unwind? Or, you know, how do we use design thinking and different approaches to provide clarity so that things can move more smoothly? So it's an interesting thought.
Well, thank you everyone for all of these comments, and I wish that we could keep chatting about all of this, because it just leaves so much more to explore, all of the different possibilities that you've opened up in this conversation. So I look forward to continuing the dialogue and to exploring how we're going to take these interviews and the information that we've captured here and go back and apply this back into the Sustainable Development Goals in London, and figuring out, you know, how can we best identify how we're achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and where we need to put focused attention to move the areas that are blocked forward. And so for me, what's really landing is the interconnectedness that you all described, how we're not able to take one project and just name it as necessarily addressing one particular sustainable development goal. Each project or each initiative is addressing many of the goals. And so that's quite poignant for me. And before we end the session, I just wanted to give Luis some time to talk us through what are the possible next steps for if you enjoyed this conversation and you want to learn more about what we're doing and you want to get involved. Luis, if you could take some time to just walk us through what are the next steps.
Thanks, Misha. So we really have some ideas on how to improve the prototype and how to connect what we did with some other initiatives happening in the city. Like I mentioned, the Dundas Open Street, and September 17th, 2020, Parking Days will be turning 10 years old. So this might be another interesting initiative, and then we can share the link later from the folks from Good City Co. But like as a call to action, we can invite you to put forward your own neighborhood project, the things that you're working with, you're involved in, to be interviewed and to showcase on the website, and to show how it is working towards the SDGs. The website that Misha showed earlier is the communitygoals.ca. And also you can carry out, if you want, you can carry out your own interview using the method that you used on a neighborhood project. And I think this is one of the strong points, is to connect with something that you're not very familiar with, you're not super involved, but could connect you to your neighborhood and to understand more what is happening in your city, in your ward, in your street even. In a more like a macro, still kind of local level, is really support public policies that will foster those integrated solutions with social, environmental, and economic targets based on the local SDGs. You can join our mailing list, and we'll share this information with you as well. And yeah, please just check out and follow the Community Goals website, and maybe we'll even have more ideas and more conversations and more way to explore neighborhoods, SDGs, and to understand why and how to make place matters. Judi, you started us with our poem at the beginning on community. Would you like to just do closing for us?
So this is just short, but it's just kept with me, and it's called Do Not Be Daunted. Do not be daunted by the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercifully now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. So those two last lines, you are not obligated to complete the work. And the solving the SDGs is a huge, huge, but neither are you free to abandon it.
Thank you, Judi.
Thank you very much.
And thanks everyone for being here today, and we look forward to connecting with you soon.